Picture this. A girl's scream echoes through the stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle on a winter night in 1457 AD. The sound cuts through the howling wind like a blade through silk. In a chamber lit only by flickering candles, 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort grips the bloodied sheets beneath her, her small body convulsing with pain that no child should ever endure. The midwives whisper prayers in Latin, their faces grave in the dancing shadows. Outside, snow falls on the frozen ground of Bedfordshire. But inside this room, a future King of England is being torn from a girl barely past childhood herself. Margaret's auburn hair clings to her sweat-drenched face as another wave of agony crashes over her. She is dying, they think. The baby is too large, her hips too narrow. At 13, her body is not finished growing. Yet here she labors to bring forth the son who will one day sit upon the throne of England as Henry VII. The irony is lost on no one present. This child, born of such suffering, will end the bloodiest conflict in English history and found the Tudor dynasty that will reshape the world. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten story of survival, sacrifice, and triumph, I want to ask you to join me in exploring these incredible tales from history. If you're fascinated by the hidden truths of the past, hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with someone who loves history as much as you do, and if you haven't already, subscribe to stay connected for more gripping narratives like this. Your engagement keeps these stories alive, and it's amazing to think we're exploring the past together, from every corner of the globe. Drop a comment below to let me know where you're tuning in from. I'd love to hear how these ancient stories resonate with you. Wherever you are, the girl writhing in that bed was no ordinary noble maiden. Lady Margaret Beaufort carried within her veins the blood of kings, specifically the blood of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III. But royal blood, as Margaret would learn, could be both a blessing and a curse. In the savage political landscape of 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses would soon tear the realm apart, such bloodlines made you either a valuable pawn or a dangerous threat. Margaret's path to that birthing chamber began years earlier, when she was a child playing in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle. Born around May 1443 to John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she entered a world where alliances shifted like sand and marriage was the ultimate weapon of statecraft. Her father died when she was barely a year old, some say by his own hand after military defeats in France left him broken. Others whispered of poison, for in those days, whispers of poison followed every noble's unexpected death. John Beaufort's death haunted Margaret's early years. He had commanded English forces in France during the 100 Years' War, watching as territories won by Henry V slipped away. The disasters ate at him. When he returned to England in 1444, courtiers noted his hollow eyes. On May 27, 1444, he was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official cause was fever, but those closest to him suspected suicide or poison. Whether by blade or the weight of failure, John Beaufort had chosen death over dishonor. Margaret's mother, the formidable Margaret Beauchamp, known as the Dagger Duchess for her sharp resolve, wasted no time securing her daughter's future. By age 6, Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The contract bound two powerful families, but when Suffolk was murdered in 1450, that betrothal became worthless. Suffolk's crime was negotiating Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and surrendering Maine and Anjou to France, terms that enraged England. His death was brutal. Dragged from his ship, he was beheaded with a rusty sword, requiring 6 clumsy blows. The Beaufort women learned survival meant adaptability. Margaret's next betrothal was to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI through his mother's marriage to Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts with questionable legitimacy, but they had the king's favor. Owen Tudor's secret marriage to Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow, had produced Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom Henry VI elevated. In 1455, at approximately 12 years old, Margaret married Edmund Tudor at Bletsoe Castle. The Great Hall was adorned with tapestries of her Beaufort ancestors, the chapel housing her grandfather's tomb. Edmund, in his 20s, was seasoned by war. Margaret was still a child. The marriage was consummated immediately, a trauma she never spoke of, its impact evident in her body's permanent damage and intense religious devotion. Within months, Margaret's body began changing, terrifying her young mind. Her mother watched her daughter's growing belly with anxiety. She had been 18 at Margaret's birth, old enough to survive. At 12, Margaret faced a deadly ordeal. Edmund would never see his child. In autumn 1456, campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. Whether he died of plague or was murdered remains unclear. Disease was a convenient excuse, but chroniclers noted his swift decline and lack of medical care. By November 1456, 13-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and alone in a world sliding into civil war. The news of Edmund's death reached her at Lampay Palace in Pembrokeshire. A messenger arrived on a rain-soaked evening, his boots echoing in the chapel where Margaret prayed. She knew her world had shattered. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother, took responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law, bringing her to Pembroke Castle in Wales, a fortress perched above Milford Haven. The journey was grueling. Winter roads were rutted with mud, and Margaret traveled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt sending pain through her swollen body. Pembroke's massive stone walls offered protection, but its cold, drafty chambers provided little comfort. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was brutal, with ice on the windows and wind whistling through the stones. Margaret, barely able to walk, struggled under her pregnancy's burden. The castle's physician, Dr. Lewis Carlion, examined her with alarm. Her hips were too narrow, the baby poorly positioned. Birth would be dangerous. Carlion, a learned man with 40 years of experience, confided to Jasper that Margaret's pelvis was underdeveloped. The baby was large and in distress. He outlined grim options: turning the baby risked killing both, waiting increased the child's risk, and a cesarean was likely fatal for Margaret. Jasper, only 25, faced a terrible choice. If Margaret died, the Tudor line might end. If she lived but lost the child, the same could follow. As her pregnancy progressed, Margaret showed maturity beyond her years, studying politics and statecraft with Jasper's guidance. She learned to read people and navigate alliances. Her religious devotion intensified. She prayed for hours in the chapel, memorizing Latin prayers and studying theology, perhaps to cope with her trauma. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, taught her that prayer needed action. On that January night in 1457, Margaret's labor began with crushing pain. She collapsed on the battlements, and her attendants rushed her to her chamber. The midwives, led by Dame Gwen Firk-Daffod, prepared with grim efficiency. Gwen, with 30 years of experience, knew herbs and techniques, but grew grave examining Margaret. The chamber filled with the smoke of lavender and rosemary. For 18 hours, Margaret endured agony, her screams fading to gasps. Jasper paced outside, hearing each cry like a blade. Servants hurried with water and linen, while Father Meredith prayed in the chapel. As dawn neared, Margaret's strength failed. She was bleeding internally, her pulse weak. The midwives decided on manual extraction, a risky procedure. Gwen prayed to St. Margaret of Antioch as she worked. When the baby emerged, the room fell silent. The infant was pale, barely breathing. Then Gwen cleared his throat, and his wail announced Henry Tudor, future king. Margaret, barely conscious, heard her son's cry through a haze. Gwen placed him on her chest briefly before rushing him to the fire. Margaret's eyes followed, memorizing his face. Her injuries were severe. Extensive tearing and internal damage meant she would never bear another child. At 13, her reproductive life was over. Her recovery was slow and agonizing. For weeks, she battled fever and infection. Carlion used bloodletting and herbal remedies, while Gwen spooned broth between her lips. The psychological toll was immense. Nightmares and a fear of touch haunted her. Her love for Henry was complicated by memories of her pain. Yet Margaret's spirit remained unbroken. She understood her son was the Lancastrian future and that a widow with a baby needed protection. The Wars of the Roses were escalating. The 1455 Battle of St. Albans had set York against Lancaster. Richard, Duke of York, claimed the throne through Edward III's second son, while the Lancastrians held it through John of Gaunt. Margaret, with Beaufort blood, was tied to a faltering cause. Henry VI was weak, possibly insane. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was capable but hated. In 1458, Margaret married Sir Henry Stafford, a Yorkist sympathizer chosen for political utility. The quiet wedding reflected her weakened state. The marriage was a business partnership. Margaret retained her estates, Stafford provided protection, and Henry remained with Jasper in Wales. The marriage lasted 14 years, through bloody conflicts. Margaret navigated the shifting tides, cultivating ties with women like Elizabeth Woodville and secretly communicating with Margaret of Anjou. Her son grew distant in Wales, raised by Jasper. Margaret sent coded letters and gifts, living in constant fear for his safety. Henry's Welsh education included noble skills and survival tactics. He learned Welsh, earning loyalty from locals. Margaret studied law, history, and theology, amassing a vast library. In 1461, Edward IV's victory at Towton devastated the Lancastrians. 50,000 fought, half died. Henry VI fled to Scotland, Margaret of Anjou to France. Margaret's Lancastrian blood made her suspect, but Stafford's ties protected her. Her son, however, was a potential rallying point. She built an intelligence network to monitor threats, bribing clerks and merchants for news. In 1469, Stafford was wounded at Edgecote, his bitterness growing. Margaret nursed him, subtly shifting his loyalties by highlighting Yorkist failures. By 1470, the Earl of Warwick allied with Margaret of Anjou to restore Henry VI. Margaret saw hope for her son's return. Henry VI's brief restoration in 1470 was a miracle, but Edward IV returned in 1471, defeating Warwick at Barnet and crushing the Lancastrians at Tewkesbury. Edward, Prince of Wales, died, and Henry VI vanished, making young Henry Tudor the Lancastrian heir. Jasper, fearing for his life, took him to Brittany in September 1471. The hurried departure from Tenby left Margaret unaware until days later. The shock was overwhelming. She was separated from her son by the English Channel. Margaret's grief hardened into ambition. She built networks to support Henry's return. Stafford died in 1471, possibly from his wound or stress. Now twice widowed, Margaret chose power, marrying Thomas Stanley, a politically astute noble. The 1472 wedding was elaborate, signaling her importance. Stanley's military and political resources aided her cause, while she brought Beaufort prestige. They navigated Edward IV's reign, surviving purges. Margaret maintained coded communications with Henry in Brittany, where his position was precarious. Her intelligence network spanned palaces and guilds, tracking threats and allies. Edward IV's death in 1483 left 12-year-old Edward V as king, but Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power, imprisoning Edward V and his brother. Richard III's coronation in July 1483 sparked suspicion. Margaret saw opportunity. Henry's claim gained traction. She plotted with Bishop John Morton, coordinating a rebellion. The 1483 revolt failed due to betrayal, and Margaret was placed under house arrest. Undeterred, she continued plotting. In August 1485, Henry invaded at Milford Haven. At Bosworth Field, Stanley's forces betrayed Richard III, securing Henry's victory. Crowned Henry VII, he united the houses through marriage to Elizabeth of York. Margaret became England's most powerful woman but never regained a simple maternal bond with Henry. She died in 1509, days after his coronation, having founded the Tudor dynasty. Her sacrifices, her body, motherhood, and happiness, ended the Wars of the Roses. In Westminster Abbey, her tomb's inscription speaks of her achievements, but not the screams of a 13-year-old girl bringing forth England's future in a Welsh castle, where the wind still carries her story. Let's keep these stories alive. If Margaret's resilience inspired you, hit that like button. Share this with friends who love history, and subscribe to join our community. Your support fuels more tales, connecting us through the past. Comment where you're watching from. I can't wait to hear from you.